I'm here to talk to you about an AI framework for counter-human trafficking. Counter-human trafficking is a very serious issue that affects our time. About 1 in every 200 people are impacted by modern-day slavery, either in the form of sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And about 58% of those, according to recent statistics by the ILO, are women and children. So the question is, as we go about our day-to-day business and we do these commercial-driven analytics and we do these mission-focused analytics, I think it's a great thing to keep in the back of our minds, like, how can we take this technology and use it for good purposes? Because, chances are, I think it was brought up by a speaker the other day, chances are these kind of technologies, AI and analytics, are going to be used for nefarious purposes as well. So this is something we can keep in mind, and we can all, consider as we go about our day-to-day, what can we do to use AI, technology, text analytics for good, escalate the ability to identify bad actors and do something about them. And I'll show you over the course of today just a bit of a framework around AI for counter-human trafficking. Just looking at how we can go about taking some of these methods, inserting them into a bit of a pipeline, doing visualizations, and coming out with a bit of actionable information at the end of the day. And so this is me. Please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or by Twitter. I'd love to, especially if you have a stake in this kind of field, I'd love to talk to you personally if you have some kind of connection to data for good or counter-human trafficking. I met some really interesting folks last year who did some great work, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. And this is all a real work in progress, too. If you have ideas for how to improve this, taking some of this data and running simulations, how can we make this more predictive, I would love to hear it. The only thing I'm going to talk about around SAS is how we've been in this business of analytics and artificial intelligence for as long as it's been around. And the idea is, we want to go from data to intelligence. And analytics is this way of getting actionable information, identifying meaningful patterns that can be used to take action from data, whereas artificial intelligence is this domain where we're interested in emulating human tasks. So these two marry up together in actually a quite great way. AI is actually a part of analytics in our definition of analytics. And it can be used to, we see a lot of AI applications from like chatbots and natural language translation, but it all fits into a pretty fantastic pipeline that can also assist in day-to-day user tasks. And at SAS, we really believe that having like people at the core of these tasks. We use the AI to essentially empower human intuition and provide analysts with the idea of like, where do we go next? So I already talked about counter-human trafficking. Let's talk a little bit about what a framework would look like to assist counter-human trafficking. And I'm going to show you a couple of data sets, one from Department of State that we worked on, and one from Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project that we've worked on, and really talk about like, when do you use what methods? When would you use traditional analytics methods, like a rule-based taxonomy to extract relationships, versus where would you apply deep learning maybe to identify victims in more context than you originally knew about. So we'll start by talking about these strategic objectives of improving data accuracy and creating interactive visualizations. Part of this is by enhancing our data sources, by adding metadata using these techniques that I'm going to talk about. And then later we'll drill down into tactical objectives. Really, how would you get this in the hands of an actual practitioner, or maybe even like a cop on the street who really doesn't work with technology a whole lot? How can you make this something that they can pick up and intuitively use? So we'll start with this idea of making better strategic decisions with multiple data sources. And so to do this, I'll introduce, does anybody know about the US Department of State Trafficking in Persons report? I'm really glad everybody came anyway. This is a report that the US Department of State puts together, and they put a lot of work into this every year. They have a whole division that assesses conditions in trafficking for about 200 countries. And it includes what are the primary countries that those countries are connected to, what kinds of trafficking is going on between those countries, and then includes a host of data about what the countries are trying to do about it, and if their neighbors and them are in cooperation trying to assess those trafficking patterns. So you can imagine there's a wealth of data incorporated in this, especially over the course of years that Department of State and other NGOs can use to determine how well we're doing and if things are getting better or worse. But the problem is this is all embedded across, even just in 5 years, about 1,000 reports, 6 pages long each, 60,000 sentences worth of data, and nobody can keep all of that in their head at once. This is a nice place where we can apply some text analytics techniques like the ones we've talked about over the course of these sessions. And this is a bit of a rules-based approach where there are tons of sentences like this. NGOs report an increase in number of Albanian children subjected to forced labor in Kosovo and the United Kingdom. And so from that statement, we can extract, with text analytics pretty regularly, this kind of structured data that surrounds what actually happened in this case. And when we extract thousands of statements like this, now instead of making people read through reports to figure out the 1 hops or 2 hops or 3 hops in trafficking patterns, because a lot of these countries that are mentioned are just transit countries, and it's really not giving you the full picture of what countries are connected to what other countries. And the fact is they're all interconnected. Now we can go to geospatial linkages like this, where I could focus in on an area like Nigeria. The color of the lines is indicative of whether or not the countries in question are doing something about it. In this visualization, depending on how red the bubble is surrounding the country, is indicative of how many statements about the country that were extracted mention children. And so we see we have a bit of a hub in West Africa, in East Africa, and then a bit of connections coming from Europe as well. And later I'll talk about how we could drill down on this, like using other data sets. But right off the bat, we're getting a picture of trafficking patterns that we didn't have just by reading the reports. And then when we look at the globe as a whole, we start seeing more about how these trafficking patterns come together, especially when we're looking at themes like stress centrality, which is indicative of if I want to go from point A to point B on the graph, where those could be any 2 points, what are the nodes on the graph that are receiving the most stress and or traffic? And in this case, we might know about certain areas like, let's say, Nigeria, but maybe we didn't know that Spain just happens to be connected to so many countries and then also is one of the primary links between the 2 hemispheres. Did I say that right? East and West? Yeah.
Is there a reason why the US is excluded?
Thank you for mentioning that. I was going to say, the US doesn't self-report what countries they're connected to. So they say in the US Trafficking in Persons report, the US is connected to other countries, and pretty much every country you're seeing on here when it comes to trafficking. So when you pull data up like this, it very egregiously highlights the fact that the US doesn't report specifically what countries they're connected to. So thank you for asking that. So it might be very interesting then, like when I know at a high level what are these trafficking patterns are, I could continue then to drill down on individual countries now and determine other factors like if I drill down on the armed conflict location event data set, this is hundreds of thousands of armed conflict events. And this is just one of the ways where we can determine what are some of the factors affecting a country that creates vulnerabilities. We have ACLID data for the Middle East and Africa. This is just one data set I'm using as an example. There are lots of other data sets which could inform trafficking, but this one is publicly available and it's very clean and very informative. And if you're doing anything related to text analytics and you want a data set to work with or try things out with, or AI, I really recommend this one because there's a lot of structured data in the data set, countries, what they're connected to, other information. This is just a few of the fields that you get. We have hundreds of thousands of these where I have like an event type, I have notes, I have a location. And so one of the things we can do is build a model in SAS. In particular, we have a Boolean model which generates Boolean rules or combinations of terms that tend to be associated with, let's say, violence against civilians versus the other event types which are more related to, say, battles. And this can be indicative of things that are happening to villages, people in the villages that are creating trafficking vulnerabilities. Then this gives me another layer to drill down on when I want to understand what's going on in Nigeria, and maybe I want to ask, well, how are armed groups impacting vulnerabilities and trafficking in that region? I can drill down and see, like, these are some of the key terms and phrases which are associated to violence against civilians, and here's where all those events play out over a particular time period, where now I can see, okay, kidnapping is happening, abductions are happening, villages are being attacked, there are certain mentions of armed groups like Boko Haram, and like the Fulanis as well. So these are all creating armed conflict events in the region and resulting in trafficking vulnerabilities. Then I can drill down on any one of these and see where in the region they're impacting and maybe take appropriate action if I'm a government or a non-government organization. And this is also interesting to see where are those patches where maybe, does this work? Yeah. Where are those patches where maybe nothing is being reported? Because that could be indicative of something as well. And this is also where we could go about incorporating AI-type capabilities. So here's a visualization where I started with some known victims. Like I know if women, children, villages, or camps are mentioned in an armed conflict event, it's probably talking about like an attack that's resulting in trafficking vulnerabilities. So if I can find a way to either use those or identify other key terminology in my data set in the right kind of context that's talking about victims, I can identify other trafficking vulnerabilities. But how do I go about doing that? You know, I could do a straight up rules-based model where maybe I have like a list of 30 terms, and that might be very precise in terms of identifying trafficking vulnerabilities, but maybe I'm not catching everything. Or, you know, we've talked a little bit about recurrent neural networks maybe. This is an AI method, and those can be used against, say, like hand-annotated training data, but it takes a very long time to put enough data on this problem or manually annotate enough data. But then another way I could do this is maybe use rules-based methods to feed that training data. So I could go through, and this could be a higher precision, you know, task, higher recall, better time to value. And the idea here is instead of like manually tagging a bunch of data with victims, maybe I use a rules-based model as a starting point. Like I have ways to identify these are all key terms related to trafficking, displaced people, mention of certain camps, and I create this, you know, taxonomy around this and create a rules-based model to extract, you know, all these instances of trafficking. Maybe I'm extracting all mentions of noun groups when it's in the context of certain key phrases like kidnapping or abduction or refugee camps or displacement. Those could all be indicative of trafficking vulnerabilities. And then another way we can do this, and this is something really cool that SAS provides, unique to SAS, is we can use auto-generated concept rules. And so this is pretty cool in that like I could take 4 terms like civilian, women, child, and village. And then I could just select.
Who does that, sorry?
This is SAS. This is a SAS particular capability to auto-generate concept rules. If I start with 4, even, it will give me all these different contexts for which they occur in, but then also which other similar concepts like residence or town or state occurs in as well. And then I can take all of those different terms and phrases that come out and provide them to analysts again in order to drill down and further explore these different themes. Maybe certain themes popped up that I was unaware of, like I want to understand what's specifically happening with Somali villages, or how does the Nigerian High Court play into this, or how are Chinese workers being impacted, or oil workers, are these two actually the same? You know, where are Boko Haram gunmen attacking? All that stuff, and these came out of one of these models that I built against phrases that I didn't start looking for, but found with these models.
So this heat map, what tool did you use?
This is all done in SAS Visual Analytics. It's part of the SAS Via platform. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I might want to put this in the hands of investigators. And I'm just going to check on the time real quick. And so here's an example visualization where I've gone out and now I've pulled information back from both Wikipedia and the CIA Factbook, just an example of how I can populate information about a country in the context of all of the factors which could influence trafficking conditions. So now we're looking at the whole country at a high level here. This is Nigeria, and then we're also interested in geography, economy, government, population groups, maybe seeing how some of these change over time, if we have the right kinds of data supporting this. We have data around armed conflict actors, so I'll flush out this tab a little bit, where now I could drill down on certain armed conflict actors, like, let's say, Boko Haram, better understand the organizational profile, and then now here are all the different events that involve attacks by Boko Haram or events in the armed conflict data set in Nigeria over a course of time. And you can see that in more recent years, there's much less mention of Boko Haram in the south and west because they've been pushed back to the upper right-hand region of Nigeria, where they are actually still active. And then you can see that Boko Haram is also being mentioned in Cameroon, Niger, and Chad as well. So,
Can you see over time?
yeah, and this is where simulation can come in. This is something that came out of like the AI conference I came to. Like, what if like we looked at these over time and saw where the attacks were coming in place? We can probably start identifying using simulation methods where attacks might happen next. So this is most of what I wanted to show you today, going in and just giving you an idea of how we can take some of these analytics methods, text analytics methods, and do something beyond some of the commercial applications, being more mission-driven and putting like capabilities in the hands of people. Maybe using that visualization we had before, we'd have a better understanding of, okay, because this is an area that goes beyond Nigeria, I might want to incorporate border security. Or if I'm an NGO delivering food to besieged villages, these are areas I need to avoid because there's a potential that those supplies could just be seized. So we talked about incorporating multiple data sources, targeting indicators of trafficking, and then the last bit, we use a capability called SAS Visual Investigator to really like view the whole picture. And I'd be interested in like combining some of the capabilities we saw around like knowledge graphs and such in concert with human trafficking. But I'll reserve questions to the end. I want to be mindful of the time and make sure that my fellow presenter has some time to present as well. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions later.